welcome to Radio Graham. Vote Labor, Liberal or National in Australia, and what do you get? You get onshore and offshore prison camps for people that Aussie racists despise. We are on the same intolerant path that Hitler, Stalin and Pol Pot took. But if only one racist tiger changes their stripes as a result of this video, my life's work will have been done. Rug up, it's cold and wet in Canberra.
Good evening. I wanted to welcome everyone to tonight's meeting, which is being organised by the Canberra Refugee Action Committee. I'd like to thank Lucy and Jasper and Scott for sharing with us the snippets of refugee stories as people came into the hall, just to give an insight into the horrors that refugees and asylum seekers face and the reasons why they flee, and then the trauma that they face when they come and arrive in Australia. Of over 6,400 people in detention, 983 are children. And despite the numerous reports documenting the damage and harm that is done by mandatory detention, with people stripped of their dignity and any certainty of their future, this government has the audacity to continue to claim that their policies are driven by humanitarian motives. The evidence to the contrary is stark and terrifying.
Just I want to talk to Australian people. Please help us. We need freedom. We are human. We are not animals.
With the new senators taking their seats on July 7, this meeting is being held to send a message to Parliament that we stand by the refugees and asylum seekers and we stand for their rights. Professor William Maley is the Director of the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at the ANU. He is also Vice President of the Refugee Council of Australia and has been a visiting research fellow in the Refugee Studies program at Oxford University. Professor Maley has written extensively about Afghan politics and has been a very vocal critic of refugee policy in Australia over many years. Please welcome Professor William Maley.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think the fact that we have come out on the Canberra equivalent of St Agnes Eve in terms of the weather is a good measure of the extent to which public policy in respect of refugees is a matter of grave moral concern to all of us. I want to begin by saying a little bit about duties towards refugees and then a little bit about domestic politics, and I'll conclude with some remarks about the more spurious lines of argument that are being circulated to try to justify current public policy settings. We owe duties to refugees for a number of different reasons. One is a simply legal reason that Australia in 1954 under the Menzies government acceded to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, and in doing so absorbed a burden of responsibility voluntarily, which then as a matter of international law binds Australia as a state, not simply the government that ratified the convention. And this is undoubtedly an important source of obligation. But finally, there's a basically humanitarian obligation towards refugees as well, that we would expect that if we were in their situation, we would be treated humanely. And we cannot deny people that kind of protection and then expect that we would be treated any more humanely by other people if we were to find ourselves in dire circumstances. And that's something of which I think some of our politicians need to be persistently reminded. I am totally cynical about the motivations that underpin the policy settings we witness at the moment, for a very simple reason. We know from the WikiLeaks material that in 2009, a cable from the US Embassy to Washington reported a conversation between a US diplomat and a Liberal Party senior official, in which that official said that the arrival of boats without authorisation was fantastic, and the more boats that come, the better. And that gives us as clear an indication as we could wish to find of the way in which the tragic plight of people fleeing persecution has become disgustingly entangled with the ambitions of political parties to secure votes from the most rancid and unpleasant elements of the electorate. And in that sense, what we continue to face is the long shadow of Pauline Hanson cast across the political landscape. In a sense, what we lack crucially in this particular area is leadership, and more I'm reminded of Napoleon III's famous comment, I must follow the crowd since I am their leader. You see that from too many people. It's inconceivable that a John Curtin or a Robert Menzies would have been so craven in the face of rabid radio shock jocks as we see with too many political leaders at the moment. What I think is most alarming to most of us about current policy is the extent to which deterrence has become a central element of what is being attempted. And there, anybody who's read a little bit about deterrence theory would realise that it is intrinsic in the notion of deterrence that you give people a bad time or you threaten to them. There is nothing in a deterrent approach which leaves space for treating people humanely or decently, or providing them with the kind of care that somewhat naively the expert panel on asylum issues reporting to Julia Gillard suggested might be supplied in places like Nauru or Manasana. It's not remotely surprising that these places have turned into hellholes. That is actually the point of the exercise. But it is also an exercise which is profoundly corrupting to people who put that kind of regime in place. And there I think it's worth bearing in mind a comment that was once made by Nietzsche, who said that if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. And I think we see that if we look at the Dorian grey features of some people who have been ministers of immigration in the past. And we look at the square jaws and thin lips of people who have been more recently in that kind of position. Now, this I think is a problem for us, and there's one other element of policy which is a problem for us as well, irrespective of how refugees are treated, and that is when the executive arrogates to itself the demand to be able to determine what is good for everyone. One of the casualties is likely to be the rule of law. And over a long period of time, we've seen systematic, although sometimes unsuccessful, efforts by the government to limit the scope of judicial review of administrative action in these kind of areas. And that itself is an extremely dangerous development, because if one can put the executive above the law in the area of refugee and immigration policy, it's only a matter of time before people will want to be put in a similar position in respect of tax and social security and a whole range of areas which impact on the lives of ordinary people more directly. But we know, of course, from cases such as that of Cornelia Rao and Vivian Solon, that it's not too long after you put officials above the reach of the law that they begin to get very slack and very slippery in the standards of behaviour that they apply, and that then becomes a problem for all of us as well.
And we stand for their rights. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has been an activist for refugee rights for many years, well before entering federal parliament in 2008. Previously, he was an activist for justice for refugees in South Australia. Senator Hanson-Young continues to challenge the morality of refugee policies of both current and previous Australian governments. She's a strong supporter of grassroots refugee action groups and is a regular visitor to Australia's detention centres, meeting and working directly with asylum seekers and refugees. Please welcome Senator Sarah Hanson-Young.
wonderful speech. I think it's a good reminder to me of just how much education there needs to be of some of my colleagues back up on the hill. I'd firstly like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and in doing that, reflect on how they have shared their country with us. It always strikes me that when I speak at events or talking to local community groups, the massive amount of support that is just so innate from Australia's Indigenous communities. They think, well, didn't you all come on a bloody boat anyway? They don't think that we should be having this awful debate. They want us to be focusing on the issues that we have and how we can learn to get along and support each other now, rather than making more divisions that aren't needed. I want to tell you a couple of stories tonight, because one of the things that I get to do that most people don't is be able to visit detention centres. And I've visited all the detention centres. I've been to Manus and Nauru and Christmas Island and all of those on the mainland. And I've been doing this for a long time, long before I was in politics, but mostly now that I'm in the Senate. And I get to walk around, I get to inspect, I get to talk to people, but most of all, I get to learn and hear people's stories. And one of the best things that I can do in this debate and in my work is to be able to retell those stories, because the entire focus of mandatory detention, offshore detention, deterrence versus support and help is to alienate and dehumanise refugees simply because of how they got here. And one of the best things to break down that stigma is to be able to put a face and a name and a story to the people that we're talking about. And in opening, I just want to explain to you what my 6-year-old daughter said to me in the midst of the election campaign last year. Obviously, it was a campaign that was fought and won on a number of three-word slogans, but one of them being "Stop the Boats." And so the issue of asylum seekers was hot as during the election campaign, and it hasn't really gone away. I came home late one night. I'd been out on the campaign trail, and my daughter, she was meant to be asleep, but she wasn't, and I went in to say goodnight to her, and she said, "Well, Mummy, what have you been doing today?" And I said, "Well, actually, I was talking about refugee children today." And she said, "Refugee children, yeah, they're running away from ogres and hot lava." And I thought, well, even she gets it. And she said, "Mummy, are we going to give them a house?" "We can give them a house. All these refugee children running away from ogres and hot lava, we should give them a house." And it's that type of simplicity, compassion and empathy that we're actually missing from the Australian debate and in the halls of our parliament. Professor Maley went through the pros and cons of deterrence policies. And for those of us who have been campaigning on this issue for a long time, I don't think there was any clearer or worse example of how far the deterrence policies have gone as when we heard of the death of Reza Barati on Manus Island back in February. And of course, 4 months later, there has been no charges laid. There has been no arrests for the death of that young man. And in fact, people who were involved in the attacks on asylum seekers inside their compound are still employed, working both inside and on the perimeter fences of that detention centre. One man inside the centre who contacted me the other day said he had a medical appointment. And in Manus Island Detention Centre, you have to get in a car to drive to the other end of the centre in order to get to the doctor. And he got into the back of the ute, and the security guard was driving. The security guard turned around, looked at him, and he shrieked and jumped, and the asylum seeker shrieked and jumped out because the person driving the car had only weeks earlier been beating him up inside the detention centre. There is something seriously wrong with our system of outsourced justice that we allow this situation to continue. The Australian government pays for the entire running of the Manus Island Detention Centre. We even pay the police force who are on the perimeter fences, not just the people inside. The contracts are signed by the Australian government. The legal fees that the PNG government under Peter O'Neill that are being accrued in defence of the centre against domestic challenges in PNG are being paid by the Australian government. The inquiry into whether it's a human rights violation, Manus Island Detention Centre, that was quashed, the challenge against that inquiry was paid for by the Australian government. We may think that we can outsource the contracts, the uniforms, and we can push people out of sight, out of mind. But we cannot outsource. We cannot outsource our moral responsibilities.
Australia is a rich country, and we have a legal and ethical responsibility to look after these children who have already dealt with so much trauma in their young lives. It is beyond comprehension why the Labor and Liberal parties continue their race to find the most inhumane policy on this issue.
My name is Raj. I'm 12 years old. My parents were both killed in the civil war in Sri Lanka. On the boat to Australia, I thought I was going to die too. The boat sprang a leak and we saw sharks in the water. Everyone was seasick, terrified, and desperate for drinking water. We knew that others had died at attempting this voyage, but we felt we had no choice.
Australian detention centres are mental illness factories. These should be closed, and people seeking asylum should be allowed to live freely in the community.
My name is Tran. I'm 16 years old. I've been in detention for 8 months now. At first, I was looking forward to starting a new life here, but now I'm beginning to lose hope that I'll ever get out. I cut my arms and sometimes think about suicide. My family is waiting to hear that I'm all right. I can't bear to tell them the truth.
Many of us who campaign on these issues and speak out publicly get dismissed. Oh, you're just the compassionate type. Oh, you know, you're thinking with your heart, Sarah, not with your head. Well, actually, I'm pretty proud that I think with my heart, actually. But furthermore, compassion is not a sign of weakness. Turning a blind eye and turning your back on someone who needs help, I tell you what, I'll leave that to the cowards. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Julian Burnside QC. Julian Burnside is an eminent Australian barrister, human rights and refugee advocate. He has been this year awarded the Sydney Peace Prize, a very prestigious prize. Julian Burnside has been key in setting up spare rooms for refugees and spare lawyers for refugees, programs which provide free accommodation and legal representation for refugees in Australia. Please welcome Mr. Julian Burnside.
very much. Bill and Sarah basically said everything I was going to say, so I'll just go back to Melbourne. I'm really impressed with so many people coming out on a cold night in Canberra, and it tells you something really important about this country, something which was betrayed at the election last September. The election last September, bear in mind, was the first in Australia's political history where the two major political parties tried to outdo each other in their promises of cruelty to a group of human beings. If they had promised cruelty to animals, it wouldn't have worked. But so poisonous is the atmosphere in this country that promising cruelty to asylum seekers wins votes. It's a scandal. Now, the other dreadful thing is that the present government is actively promoting itself and its interests by saying that it's pursuing a policy of deterrence. And Bill mentioned something about the policy of deterrence. I want you to think and remember precisely what a policy of deterrence means, because it seems that many people in Australia have not thought what a policy of deterrence means. When you think of deterrent, it means faced with two courses, you'll choose this rather than that, because you're deterred from following this course because it looks too ugly. Now, the risk of drowning, which the politicians have pointed to, is not enough to deter people from attempting to escape persecution in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and so they come down through that corridor, down to Indonesia, and there it's a dead end. Indonesia and Malaysia aren't signatories to the Refugees Convention, they don't offer protection. People remain at risk of being jailed if they stay in Indonesia, and so they have a choice. They risk their lives, knowing they're risking their lives, but that's not enough to deter them. So we have to make coming to Australia look even worse than risking your life at sea. We have to make Australia look uglier than the Taliban or the Rajapaksa regime. I wonder how many Australians there are who would relish the idea that Australia looks nastier than the Taliban or the Rajapaksa regime or the insane theocrats in Iran or any other group persecuting its citizens you want to mention. But that's what our present leaders are trying to do, and it seems that they're revelling in the idea that they've been successful. Now, I want to give you a brief thought experiment about deterrence. I want you to imagine that Scott Morrison will actually agree to meet me. And I'm going to him and I'm going to offer him a surefire method for guaranteeing that no boat people will ever again come to this country in the rest of time. He only has to do one thing that I say. And I will promise him no more boat people ever. All he has to do is to take a few children out of detention and publicly execute them. I don't think he'd do that. It would just be too obscene. It would be a morally dreadful price to pay for the result that he so desperately seeks. Well, if that's a bit too harsh for him, what about we just take a dozen kids out of detention and torture them publicly for a couple of weeks? I don't think he'd do that either. And yet he thinks it's morally all right to keep hundreds of children in detention in conditions which drive them to self-harm and attempted suicide. Thousands of adults in detention here and offshore in conditions that drive them to hopelessness and despair. What's the moral benefit in doing it that way if they're not prepared to do it publicly by executing a couple of children? They're on the same moral plane. A policy of deterrence is indecent, and no Australian should be willing to support it if only they understood what it really meant. Australia now has refugee policies which are crueler than those of any other Western nation. And the policies are supported electorally on the basis of a series of lies. It is only because of the lies that the politicians get away with it. And let me make it very clear, I don't think our politicians accurately reflect Australian values. I think most Australians are decent people. If most Australians understood what is going on instead of being misled by politicians' lies and those lies magnified by the news limited media, I don't think that most Australians would go along with it. China recently criticised us for our human rights track record. Let's be fair about the way the world is seeing us now. We are now seen as cruel and selfish, and that is not the vision of the country that most of us want. Don't let them trash our reputation.
So sad, the tears are in your eyes. Come on and come to me now. Don't be ashamed to cry. Let me see you through, 'cause I've seen the dark side too. When the night falls